stones of history are cold, but they remember everything. They remember screams that were never written down. They remember doors forced open at night and mornings that came too soon. Across empires and centuries, wars have been told as stories of flags, victories, and fallen heroes. But behind those loud stories lives a quieter truth, one that breathes in fear and silence. A truth carried in the bodies of women whose names were erased, whose pain was treated as strategy, not tragedy. This is not a story about one woman or one war. This is the story of a pattern, a system, a weapon sharpened not with steel but with terror. For more than 2,000 years, armies have learned that breaking a body can break a community, that violating a woman can silence a village, that fear can travel faster than soldiers ever could. This is the story of how violence against women became part of warfare itself, not by accident but by design. And it is the story of why it has never truly stopped. Watch all the way to the end. There's so much valuable info waiting for you. Don't forget to subscribe, tap like, and share this video. Every bit of support helps our channel grow and inspires us to make even better videos for you. Long before war had uniforms and medals, it had rules. Not rules written on paper, but rules whispered between commanders, learned through blood and fear. One of those rules was simple and cruel. If you want to control a people, you must first break what they love most. In the ancient world, armies did not only fight soldiers. They fought families, farms, temples, and futures. Cities were not just captured, they were punished. And women's bodies became one of the first battlefields. The Roman Empire is often remembered for its roads, laws, and order. But behind that image was a military system built on terror. Roman generals believed fear was more powerful than mercy. When a city resisted, punishment followed. Soldiers were allowed, sometimes encouraged, to commit violence against civilians. This was not chaos. It was policy. Roman military texts spoke openly about sending a message. A city that heard what happened to another city was less likely to resist. Violence spread faster than legions ever could. The suffering of a few became a warning to many. Over time, this idea became deeply rooted. Armies learned that harming women caused long-lasting damage. It destroyed families, created shame and silence. It made people flee their homes. A village without unity was easier to rule. A population filled with fear was easier to control. This thinking did not disappear with the Romans. It traveled through centuries, changing uniforms, flags, and languages, but keeping the same logic. Medieval armies followed similar patterns. When cities fell, violence followed. Women were treated as spoils of war, not as human beings. Commanders often looked away, understanding that terror helped maintain control. The message was always the same: resistance brings suffering. As wars became more organized, so did the violence. Armies grew larger. Supply lines formed. Records were kept. Orders were written. And within these structures, sexual violence did not disappear. It became normalized. By the modern age, war had laws. There were treaties, codes, and promises of protection for civilians. But reality on the ground often told a different story. When discipline broke down or when terror was useful, old patterns returned. What is most disturbing is that these acts were rarely random. They were repeated in the same ways in different places across different times. This repetition reveals something important. These were not accidents of war. They were tools of war. Violence against women became a method to destroy morale, force surrender, and reshape societies. It was used to punish, to dominate, and to erase identities. And because it worked, it continued. The world often explains these crimes as moments of madness, loss of control, or individual cruelty. But history tells another story. It shows planning, permission, silence from above. This chapter is not about one army or one culture. It is about a choice made again and again to use human suffering as strategy. And once a weapon proves effective, it is rarely abandoned. The world remembers battles for flags and territory, but the human cost often hides in shadows. Two of the darkest shadows fell over Nanking in 1937 and Berlin in 1945. Places where fear and violence became systematic, where women bore the brunt of armies' cruelty. In Nanking, the capital of China, Japanese soldiers advanced quickly. Their orders were clear, not just to capture the city, but to crush its people. For 6 weeks, the city became a nightmare. Women of all ages, young girls, mothers, grandmothers, were violated. Estimates vary, but tens of thousands suffered, their lives forever marked by terror. The violence was not a chaotic explosion. It was organized. Soldiers were given instructions, their actions recorded, their movements sometimes reported back to superiors. Every act was part of a terrifying system designed to humiliate, dominate, and terrorize. Families were broken. Communities were shattered. Fear became a weapon, sharper than any sword. Across the globe, 8 years later, Berlin faced its own nightmare. As the Soviet army marched into the city in 1945, an estimated 2 million German women experienced sexual violence. Many soldiers viewed it as revenge, but what unfolded was also a pattern of systematic assault. The chaos of war allowed cruelty to flourish. Authorities were often powerless or unwilling to stop it. Women tried to hide, to flee, to survive, but the sheer scale of the assaults made escape nearly impossible. Homes that should have been sanctuaries became sites of horror. What links Nanking and Berlin is not simply that atrocities occurred. It is that both events show a deliberate understanding of terror. Command structures, whether in Japan or the Soviet army, tolerated, and in some cases facilitated, the assaults. These were not random crimes. They were acts with strategic effect. Fear spread faster than bullets. The psychological damage lasted for generations, long after soldiers left the cities. The survivors carried stories they could not tell. Societies carried scars they could not erase. And yet, the outside world often ignored these patterns, choosing to remember victories, treaties, and boundaries, while the suffering of women remained hidden in footnotes. These events were not anomalies. They were echoes of ancient strategies, now amplified by modern weapons and armies. The brutality of Nanking and Berlin reminds us that when war reaches civilians, women are often the first and most visible victims. And when these acts are repeated, across decades and continents, it reveals a terrifying truth. Sexual violence is not just a side effect of war. It can be a deliberate tool, designed to destroy more than just territory. The world remembers the cities that fell, but how often does it remember the women who lived and suffered inside them? The 20th century ended, but the patterns of violence did not. In 1994, Rwanda became the stage for one of the most horrifying chapters of modern history. In just about 100 days, an estimated 250,000 to 500,000 women were sexually assaulted. Entire villages were emptied of men, while women were left behind as targets. The violence was not random chaos. It was part of an orchestrated campaign of terror. Militias, armed and encouraged by leaders, used rape to punish, to humiliate, and to instill fear in communities. Each attack was meant to destroy the social fabric, to leave families broken, and to make survival a question of endurance rather than safety. In Bosnia during the 1990s, the pattern repeated. Armed forces systematically used sexual violence as a strategy of war. Camps were organized. Women were selected, isolated, and assaulted. Documentation, survivor accounts, and post-war investigations revealed administrative planning, budgets for detention centers, and chains of command that knew, tolerated, and in some cases ordered these crimes. This was not an outbreak of individual madness. This was a calculated tool, wielded to weaken entire communities, to erase cultural identities, and to leave lasting scars on survivors and their families. What is especially chilling is how these atrocities were often normalized within the military structures themselves. Orders and instructions sometimes implicitly encouraged sexual violence. Soldiers were trained to use fear, humiliation, and domination as weapons. And while international law tried to catch up, enforcement lagged behind. Women suffered in silence while the world slowly learned to recognize their plight. The history of Rome, Nanking, and Berlin shows the pattern: terror targeting women, organized violence. Rwanda and Bosnia were modern echoes of this ancient logic. They demonstrate that sexual violence in war is not merely about personal desire or chaos. It is about power, control, and strategy. Armies use it to intimidate, to destabilize, and to leave generations traumatized. Yet, amid the horror, stories of survival emerge. Women resisted in small ways, escaping, hiding, supporting each other. Communities tried to rebuild, even when fear lingered like a shadow over daily life. These acts of courage remind the world that even in the face of systematic cruelty, the human spirit can endure. The lesson is clear: sexual violence as a weapon is not an accident. It is a deliberate, recurring tactic, one that has survived centuries because it works in the logic of war. And unless society recognizes and confronts this pattern, history will repeat itself in new places, with new names, but with the same cruelty. To understand why sexual violence persists in war, we must look beyond individual acts and see the machinery behind them. This machinery is made up of orders, budgets, logistics, and silence. It is not chaotic, it is structured, deliberate, and frighteningly efficient. Across history, from Rome to Rwanda, armies have operated on the understanding that terror is a weapon. Soldiers follow instructions, leaders create policies, and communities pay the cost. In many conflicts, sexual violence is not an accidental byproduct of fighting. It is planned, organized, and enforced. Take administrative planning, for example. Reports from modern conflicts often reveal that military leaders were aware of assaults taking place. In some cases, resources were allocated. Detention centers, armed guards, and schedules for operations were documented. Documentation is chilling because it shows awareness and intent. These acts were not hidden failures, they were deliberate actions. Strategic intent is another key factor. Sexual violence is used to break communities, punish populations for resistance, and create long-lasting psychological damage. Armies know that fear travels faster than guns. A village terrorized by assault may abandon homes, farms, and traditions. Entire cultures can be disrupted. And when women are the targets, the effect is magnified. Families are destabilized. Communities struggle to rebuild. Children grow up in trauma. Generations inherit fear. Normalization within military structures makes this machinery even more powerful. Soldiers may be trained, directly or indirectly, to see violence against women as acceptable. Orders may be implicit rather than explicit, but the culture within the army reinforces cruelty. Men who would never harm women in ordinary life can become instruments of terror in this environment. Over time, this behavior becomes routine, predictable, and disturbingly organized. History shows that this machinery does not depend on one nation, culture, or era. Whether in ancient Rome, Nanking, Berlin, Rwanda, or Bosnia, the same elements appear: planning, targeting, and repetition. Violence is calculated. Fear is the objective, and the effects last far longer than the battles themselves. Even today, the WHO estimates that more than 250,000 women in conflict zones experience systematic sexual violence each year. This is a modern continuation of patterns that are thousands of years old. The machinery may change, technology, communication, global awareness, but the logic remains the same. Terror can be weaponized, and women are often the primary targets. Understanding the machinery is not easy. It forces us to see war as more than battles and borders. It is a human tragedy with a deliberate method. And only by recognizing the system can the world hope to dismantle it. If history teaches us one lesson, it is this: the world often turns its eyes away from sexual violence in war. Silence becomes part of the machinery, and with silence, the cycle continues. When crimes go unpunished, when survivors are ignored, the strategy succeeds. The fear spreads, the pattern repeats. In Nanking, Berlin, Rwanda, and Bosnia, countless women were left to bear trauma alone. Families struggled to cope. Communities were fragmented. Many survivors carried shame imposed not by their actions, but by the world's indifference. Even after wars ended, societies often blamed victims instead of perpetrators. The cost of silence is immense. It is psychological, social, and cultural. It echoes across generations. But the silence is not only from civilians. Governments, military leaders, and even international organizations have often failed to respond decisively. Courts are slow, evidence is destroyed, witnesses are intimidated, and political interests overshadow justice. When accountability is delayed or denied, the message is clear: these acts are tolerated. The machinery of terror is allowed to function. Beyond the immediate victims, the effects ripple through entire nations. Children grow up in fear. Communities lose trust in neighbors. Cultural and social structures are weakened. Economies collapse when families cannot farm, work, or recover from the trauma inflicted upon them. A war that may last months or years leaves scars that last decades. Yet, amid despair, acts of courage emerge. Survivors tell their stories. Activists, organizations, and journalists break the silence. They document, advocate, and seek justice. In Bosnia, survivor testimonies became evidence in international tribunals. In Rwanda, communities built networks of support to help women heal. Each voice matters. Each story challenges the machinery of terror by refusing to stay hidden. The cost of silence is a reminder that understanding history is essential. Recognizing patterns, acknowledging survivors, and demanding accountability are not just moral imperatives. They are tools to prevent the repetition of cruelty. When the world refuses to stay silent, it can dismantle the machinery of terror and challenge the systems that allow sexual violence to be used as a weapon of war. The story of these women is not only one of suffering, it is also a story of resilience. And understanding their experiences is the first step toward breaking a cycle that has lasted for over 2,000 years. History is heavy with sorrow, but it also carries lessons. The repeated use of sexual violence as a weapon of war shows us how cruelty can be organized, accepted, and repeated across centuries. Yet, it also shows that change is possible if the world refuses to look away. Breaking the cycle begins with awareness. Recognizing that sexual violence is not a random byproduct of war, but a deliberate strategy, is the first step. Understanding its patterns, from ancient Rome to modern conflicts, helps governments, militaries, and international organizations prevent it. Awareness empowers societies to act before atrocities escalate, rather than only responding after lives have been shattered. Accountability is the second key. International courts, tribunals, and legal frameworks have evolved to prosecute sexual violence as a war crime. The trials after Bosnia, Rwanda, and other conflicts showed that even in war, leaders can be held responsible. Punishment is not just justice, it is a deterrent. When the machinery of terror faces consequences, it loses its power. Support for survivors is equally crucial. Trauma cannot be undone, but healing is possible. Communities, organizations, and individuals who provide medical, psychological, and social support help survivors reclaim their lives. Every woman who speaks out, every community that stands with her, weakens the system that used terror as a weapon. Education also plays a role, teaching future generations about these patterns of violence, about the courage of survivors, and about the human cost of war instills values of empathy and respect. It challenges the normalization of cruelty and empowers societies to resist repeating the same mistakes. Despite centuries of repeated atrocities, there is hope. Women have survived. Communities have rebuilt. International laws and human rights frameworks have evolved. Technology and media have made it harder to hide these crimes. And as history is recorded and shared, the world grows more capable of recognizing and responding to the machinery of terror. But hope requires vigilance. The same patterns that appeared in Rome, Nanking, Berlin, Rwanda, and Bosnia continue to echo in conflicts today. Awareness, justice, and support are not one-time solutions. They are ongoing responsibilities. Only by confronting the past can the cycle of sexual violence as a weapon of war be broken. The cost of ignoring history is too high, but the cost of remembering, understanding, and acting is the promise of a world where terror is no longer weaponized, where women can live without fear, and where future generations inherit safety rather than suffering. History is painful, but it is also instructive. And in understanding it, humanity finds the tools to change.